Nesses vários anos de Eu com isso, já falamos sobre diversos temas, e sempre vale a pena lembrar dos grandes pensadores do judaísmo. Um deles é o grande filósofo judaico, o rabino Abraham Joshua Heschel, que marcou o século XX. Nascido na Polônia e migrou aos Estados Unidos em 1940, após fugir do regime nazista que assolava sua terra natal. Após sua chegada, Heschel passou a lecionar no Jewish Theological Seminary, ou o JTS, que é o rabinato conservador em Nova York. Sua principal área de interesse era a ponte entre o judaísmo e a sociedade contemporânea, discutindo assuntos como ética e envolvimento político. Durante o auge da luta pelos direitos civis, o Dr. Martin Luther King liderou uma marcha de Selma, Alabama, até Montgomery, no mesmo estado. Uma das pessoas que participou dessa marcha ao lado de King foi exatamente ele, o rabino Abraham Joshua Heschel. Quando Heschel voltou de Selma, alguém lhe perguntou: "Você encontrou muito tempo para orar enquanto estava em Selma?" O rabino Heschel respondeu: "Eu rezei com os pés." Sua marcha, seu protesto, seu discurso pelos direitos civis foi a sua maior oração de todas. Heschel passou a ser apelidado de profeta dos profetas. Seu legado é mantido hoje por sua única filha Susannah, que é presidente do Departamento de Estudos Judaicos no Dartmouth College. Como Guggenheim Fellow, ela recebeu 5 doutorados honorários e bolsas da Fundação Ford, Fundação Carnegie, e do Centro Nacional de Humanidades dos Estados Unidos. Hoje, em parceria com a comunidade Shalom, a gente tem o prazer de recebê-la aqui online para um bate-papo como uma pequena prévia da sua visita ao Brasil, que acontecerá na semana do dia 22 de agosto. Eu sou Ana Clara Buchmann, mais conhecida como Malca, e essa é uma edição especial do E Eu Com Isso, podcast do Instituto Brasil-Israel. So, Dr. Heschel, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. We're very excited to have you in the podcast.
My pleasure.
So, the first thing I'm going to ask you is, in your opinion, what's defining Judaism for you nowadays?
Did you ask me what is defining Judaism?
Oh, I'm sorry. In your opinion, what defines Judaism for you nowadays?
Yeah, what defines Judaism for me? That would be like asking me about the air that I breathe. So, yeah. So I'm engaged in all kinds of ways in Judaism, in my synagogue, my community, in my teaching, my scholarship, my writing, and in the kinds of issues and concerns that I have politically, intellectually, all kinds of ways.
It's very interesting because you're coming to Brazil right before our election cycle. And we have a very polarized political scenario, very similar to the United States. As you were mentioning, politically speaking, how do you see Jewish engagement to democracy?
So I never see simple answers. There are always problems. But I do think that democracy, multicultural liberalism really is the only way for Jews going forward. The problem is really a problem for political theorists, which is, why is it fascism emerges out of democracies? What makes that happen? How can we analyze it and prevent it in the future? But what's clear is that when we see intimations of fascism, we see trouble for Jews, attacks on Jews. The question then today would be, first of all, so how to break the cycle of fascism emerging out of liberal democracy, such as the Weimar Republic, for instance, or even today in the United States, and certainly in South American countries, where dictatorships have come into power in Central and South America, sometimes with the help of the United States, as we're quite well aware. And the result has been terrible bloodshed. I just read Bernardo Kuczynski's extraordinary book, K, which I'm sure you've read.
Yes.
It's a book about a Polish-Jewish couple. They flee the Nazis, they come to Brazil, they marry, they have a daughter. She becomes a lecturer of chemistry at the university. And one day, after her mother has died of cancer, the father tries to reach her, and she has, so the word is disappeared, which is a problematic word. Anyway, she was murdered.
Very interesting that you're saying that, because just 3 months ago, it was March, and we were commemorating the many years of amnesty that we had after the dictatorship in Brazil, and we were talking about the story of Anna Kosinski. So even our listeners are very familiar with it.
Yes. Yes. I think that's a book that I have the feeling has changed my life. First of all, it's made me realize that when I go to South America on this trip, I'm going to be walking knee deep in a bloody swamp. There's been so much bloodshed for which my country is also responsible. It also has made me realize that some of Hannah Arendt's political insights are very important and need to be studied again, which have to do with how we as Jews function in a society that is toppling from liberalism to fascism. How do we survive? What do we do to prepare also in the future for such a possibility? But it also shows me that it didn't end in 1945, the murders of Hitler. Look at this couple. These people who came as refugees, and then their children were murdered in South America. And there's a line of continuity that means that I have to change the way I teach my Jewish history courses. After 1945, I go to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, but I think we also have to look at South America. And I think we need to pay more attention as Jewish historians to the global South and Jewish experience there, whether it's in South America, also in South Africa, some extent in Australia as well. And those are regions that have been neglected.
That's very interesting. I would have never thought that Brazil and what happened in Latin America would be somewhat crossing your path towards Jewish history. And one thing that's very remarkable about your father's work is that he was really focused on building this bridge between the communities and contemporary society. How do you see the relationship between the Bima and social action nowadays? What do you feel like compels people the most when it comes to Jewish community?
Well, one thing I think we can learn from Jews in South America is what the rest of the world looks like from a South American Jewish perspective. That is, how does America look from the perspective of, for example, Jews in Chile after the United States deposed and murdered Allende, for instance, or did so in collaboration with Chilean military forces and supported also other dictatorships. So there is a perspective that I think sharpens our attentiveness and perhaps also the responsibility that we should feel. That is, if I think of myself as an American Jew, self-satisfied, happy in this free America, and then I think about South America and what the Jews there underwent, the murder of someone's child under a dictatorship, as Kuczynski describes. I think my American Jewish identity is a bit different. And I think there's a greater responsibility for me to pay attention as a Jew to my political responsibility, my responsibility for the state itself as a liberal democratic state, what my government is doing, my responsibility for Jews in South America, and thinking in broad terms also, why do people commit atrocities like this? Why in a country such as Brazil or Argentina or Chile, why do they kill their own people? Now, I look at my country and say, why do we bomb Vietnam and bomb Cambodia and bomb civilians, peasants working in their fields? Why do we do that? That was not a war. That was just a series of atrocities that the United States committed. And my father was at the forefront protesting. I think one of the many ways in which I felt shattered when I read Kuczynski's book was that he showed me how do people in Brazil, they did this to their own people. They did this to young people, to their future, to the future generation. How could people do that? And then overall, I just can't understand how anyone can torture another human being.
And it's very interesting because if you compare different countries, the reaction to Argentinians towards the dictatorship that they went through versus the reaction that Brazilians have through the dictatorship we went through are very different. And the way we assimilate and take account on it is very different. Right now in the elections in Brazil, this sort of thing is being contested, which just shows us like in how deep of a swamp we're in.
Yes, I realize that.
And do you feel like these things are part of Judaism nowadays? I mean, at least as part of your American experience as a Jew, there's definitely different ways that we can bring in social action into our synagogues. Do you feel like nowadays it's effective the way we're doing it?
So it's very clear to me that when I was growing up, and when my father was first in the United States and he came here as a refugee in 1940, he found passivity. That even as the Jews in Europe were being murdered, the Jews in America were more worried about winning government support for establishing a state in Israel than saving the lives of Jews. That's continued in the 50s and in the early 60s. Synagogues, Jews were pretty quiet, pretty calm. And if they did get involved, be concerned, it was for Jewish interests. What my father changed was that a Jew also has responsibility for non-Jews. This is not radically new because, in fact, if you look, for instance, just as an example, there's an Orthodox rabbi in Altona, which at the time belonged to Denmark, named Yaakov Emden, Orthodox rabbi who wrote extensively. He said, look, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, it's a machloket l'shem shamayim. We're in a disagreement, but it's for the sake of heaven. That is, it's a religious disagreement. It's not a fight against each other. Sometimes, as we all know, for instance, in the Talmud, rabbis have an argument. They disagree, but their words are for the sake of heaven. The argument is that for good. That means that we don't have to be antagonists. We're not trying to destroy another community. We don't even say that I can only exist if the other one doesn't. That's not the way to think. And it's not, I don't see support for that being strong in Jewish tradition. On the contrary, what my father argued very clearly is that what God wants from us is to create more room for God in this world. How do we do that? What does it mean, the words of the Kaddish, Yiskadal v'Yiskadash Shmei Rabba, may his name be expanded in our world? How do we do that? We have to care for other human beings, for the natural world that God has created. It's God's creation. In so doing, we give strength to God. In the rabbinic idiom, there's a tzorach gavoha, a divine need. God gains strength from our behavior, helping other people. That was fundamental to my father's thinking. And so he said, when he came back from the march in Selma, I felt my legs were praying. To march on behalf of justice for another people, that too is a religious act.
But it's interesting because I hear this line a lot nowadays, which is people expect their rabbis to be the Jews they don't have the time to be, right? Do you find this to be true? And which are the ways that one can engage in expanding this Jewish identity that goes beyond what's at synagogue?
It was my father's criticism. He said, we go to the synagogue and there's vicarious davening. We sit back in our chairs and we let the rabbi and the cantor pray for us. We're not involved. We're not engaged. He said, my father said, the synagogue is where prayer goes to die, because people are just sitting there passively. Now, there are many reasons for it. My father talked about these big synagogues that were being built after World War II. It was an edifice complex. Why do we have these big synagogues? Right now, we can't even afford to maintain them, but they're also alienating. I can tell you, my father grew up in Warsaw, in a Jewish world where people davened in a small shtibel. I lived for about 6 years in Cleveland, Ohio, and I also davened in a little shtibel. It's a little wooden storefront. And who was davening there? Elderly people, people on welfare, people who were refugees. And I felt the davening was so much more intense in that atmosphere. And then comes another question. What do I do after I finish davening on Shabbat morning? And it was interesting because in one synagogue in Cleveland, big, beautiful synagogue designed by a famous architect, full of all kinds of very successful professional people who would come there. And after Shabbat morning services ended, we had what was called an oneg Shabbat. That is, they had a table spread with food and waiters passing hors d'oeuvres. I noticed that at the end, after everybody was basically gone, 90% of the food was left over. Now, in the little shtibel where I davened, we would get up from the davening and go into the next little room, and I would help the Rebbitzin dish out food for the people who were there, who, as I said, were elderly, lonely, many on welfare, who appreciated having a nice hot meal. There's a difference. And I would say, when you finish praying to God, should you have a hired servant serve you hors d'oeuvres? Or should you get up and do a mitzvah for somebody else, someone who appreciates some good food? Give them something to eat. Do a mitzvah. That should be the next thing you do. So I would say that one suggestion for some people, there's no single answer for everybody, but maybe we need to have smaller communities, smaller synagogues for a small neighborhood where we really get to know each other and help each other. Maybe we need to break down the barriers for the wealthy synagogue and the synagogue for the poor people. Can't we come together somehow? Maybe we need to define synagogues in different terms, not so much the grandeur of it or where do the women sit, but the spirit of the place. It should be a spirit that we try to build, spirit of generosity, of care for one another, of mitzvahs, of doing mitzvahs.
You're going to see that when you come to São Paulo, you're going to feel very much in a bubble. I believe that São Paulo has pockets of extreme wealth and then pockets of extreme poverty. And I believe for our community in São Paulo, it's very hard to transcend this kind of hermetic bubble that we're in. And bringing that into synagogue and bringing that into community has definitely been a challenge when you come from a country with so much inequality.
Yes, I'm sure I understand what you mean. I also just watched a Brazilian film called The Year My Parents Went on Vacation. Do you know that film?
Yes, the little kid, Michel,
Amazing.
Michel is part of Keilat Shalom back in São Paulo.
Oh, really?
Get to know him over Shabbat.
Wow. That was a great film. But you know, that film showed something that the whole world envies of Jews. And that is, it's small community, people coming together as neighbors, and a certain kind of ethnicity, ethnic identification with the food, with the language, a little Yiddish. Everybody wants that, frankly. I look in America at the evangelical Christians. They want desperately, I think, to have a kind of shtetl atmosphere. They want to be like Jews, to have an ethnic dimension where they have Christian words, Christian language, Christian daycare, all the things that we have. So then the question is, if the whole world wants to be like the Jews, except the Jews, we're the ones who are moving away from it. Why?
Yeah. And as we're talking about inequality, and I bet you're going to talk a lot about it in Brazil. Do you believe that the racial agenda has already been embraced by the Jewish communities, or there's still work to be done in fighting racism?
I actually have a book right here on my desk, sitting on my desk, and it's open. And it's called The Spectacle of the Races. And it's by Lilia Moritz-Schwartz. And it's a great book. One of the things that she shows us very clearly is that there are no national boundaries to ideas of racism. Ideas don't have national boundaries. So the ideas of racism that developed in Europe in the 19th century also came to South America and back and forth and so on. And they may be modified have a slightly different focus in certain countries, sure, but essentially it's the same. And so racism is a terrible plague on our society, certainly a plague on Jews. And no one is exempt. We also have Jewish ideas that are racist. Meir Kahane in the 1960s in the United States, then in Israel in the 70s, was pushing a racist Jewish agenda and saying never again to the Jews. My father, at the same time, was saying never again to any human being. Racism locks people into a cage, essentially, and I mean both the races and the targets. But races then have no ability to make allies. They can't form cross-cultural dimensions and so on. In other words, a racist is in it for himself and his group. We can't do that. We can't afford that in Israel, for example. And that's precisely what Israel is learning right now in forming these alliances with certain Arab countries. We can't be anti-Arab and function in the world. It's not going to work economically, socially, politically, and so forth. So I think, first of all, Jews have to understand racism that's directed against us, anti-Semitism. I think having been the targets of anti-Semitism may help us have certain insights into why racism is so tenacious, why people find it so appealing. What is it? What is it mentally, politically, psychologically? I don't know. What is it about it that's so appealing? We have to think about that. And we also have to be aware that the racism can exist within certain Jewish texts as well. We have to be aware of that and be aware that there are some people in Israel also, politicians, who are purveying racist ideas. And that's undermining Zionism in the state of Israel. It's dangerous.
I have been living here in the US for a year now, and I realize how American Jews are not as in touch with Israel as Brazilian Jews may be. In general, I think Israel is very much a part of our agenda, an everyday community back in Brazil. But here I found the possibility that you can be very Jewish, but still not find a connection or a strong connection with the Jewish state. How do you see this in the process of building a Jewish identity today? Does Israel really need to be a part of people's Jewish identities?
It's hard for me to imagine a Jew without a connection to Israel at all. We live in, for example, we live in apartment buildings or homes. We have a fire escape or a second exit just in case. Now, I don't think about it every day. What if there's a fire? How am I going to get out? It shouldn't be on my mind all the time, but Israel is the fire escape, so to speak, for all Jews all over the world. And to ignore that, given the rise of anti-Semitism today, would be extraordinarily foolish, would be like getting rid of the fire escape in your home. Don't do that. Beyond that, what concerns me more is that people have different kinds of relationships to Israel. I have very religious Jewish relatives, Haredi, Hasidim. How they feel about Israel is very different from the way secular Jews may feel. That's fine with me. I accept that. I respect it. I understand they want a certain kind of Israel. It may not be the way many Jews want to live in Israel. Okay, I think there should be a pluralistic Israel where there can be room for Haredi Jews and room for secular Jews and room for liberal religious practices. And so too with Zionism. There is some who disagree with the government. Why not? Within the Knesset itself, there are disagreements. I don't think that those disagreements or criticisms of the Israeli government are dangerous. Israel is a very strong country in every respect. If some Jews are critical of a particular government decision, fine. I think it shows the health of Zionism from the very beginning, that there were different approaches, different kinds of Zionisms. There was a Chaim Weizmann Zionism and a Jabotinsky Zionism. They coexisted. There's no reason for every Jew to toe a certain line. And what bothers me more than anything are the people who insist that you have to only have one particular way of being a Zionist. That's not good. People don't like to be forced into a way of thinking.
But between having a fire escape or an emergency exit to building a relationship with it, what's the gap between those things?
What's the gap? Some people are more involved in a conscious way with Israel, having spent time there, lived there. I've lived there. My colleague here at Dartmouth is an Israeli citizen, served in the IDF. But yes, I have students who've never been to Israel and don't fully understand it, except maybe as a remote idea.
So my last question has to do with feminism, which is something that you're going to bring up in Brazil. And my question is, as a feminist, how do you deal with the lack of representation in the Tanakh? And how should synagogues approach the topic nowadays if we're still, as women, not being represented in the liturgy in general?
Well, I think, first of all, remarkable developments have occurred in my lifetime. So when I wanted to have a bat mitzvah, it was an unheard of thing. And all I wanted was to chant the Haftorah, not the Torah. That was just beyond anything I could imagine even being possible. So look what's happened now. Girls do have a bat mitzvah. My two daughters chanted the entire parsha and the Haftorah and led the davening. That's amazing. I remember when Blue Greenberg said one day there will be Orthodox women rabbis. And I thought that's ridiculous, but there are. She was right. My father said to me, maybe you should be a rabbi. And I said, oh, they'll never take women. He said, well, things are changing. So I think what we learn from this is, first of all, to be optimistic and to have goals and to realize that the world changes. Social values, cultural values change over time, and they do so pretty rapidly. And that's true for women. It's true for gay and lesbian Jews, for example, for single parents, so many things. Now, in terms of Torah readings and synagogue services and so on, look, the Torah is like any other text. Women are omitted, not named. Yiftach's daughter doesn't have a name, and then she's killed. But I also look at passages like Bnot Tzlafchad, the daughters of Tzlafchad, who want an inheritance, and they go to Moshe Rabbeinu, and he doesn't know what to do. Should they get an inheritance? Shouldn't they? He doesn't know. And so what does he do? He asks the Kadosh Baruch Hu, he asks God, what should we do? And God tells him, give them. So in some sense, there's a lesson there that maybe we shouldn't be asking the rabbis. I remember when I was very little telling people, well, maybe men want a mechitza, but that's not what God wants. I somehow felt that. I knew that. My father used to say, Judaism is a religion of dissent. We dissent from many things. We say, no, that's not our way. And I think the way of a patriarchal society, it's not our way. We dissent. Sometimes in the past, we've had to compromise to go along with certain things in the Roman Empire. Christians did as well. Christianity is the only religion that says in its scriptures that women should wear a veil and be quiet. We don't have that. Islam doesn't have that. It's not in the Quran. It's not in the Hebrew Bible. But it was a Roman custom. But now we're not living in a Roman Empire. So we're changing. I'm far more optimistic today than I was when I was young. Do we need to create new texts? I think reading the text, for example, take Genesis 34, the rape of Dinah. Do we want to omit it? No, because rape is a huge, huge issue to this day. The question is, what do we do with that passage? How do we read it? We might want to read it in a mournful chant, for instance, a different melody from the rest of the Torah reading. She was raped, and we need to talk about it in shul. We need to say, for instance, sota. Sota is a form of sexual assault. It's outrageous. It's wrong. Plenty of people write about these things. Feminist scholars of the text, of the biblical text and of rabbinic texts, that literature also needs to be disseminated. In other words, when a rabbi gives a sermon, the rabbi should also talk about these feminist interpretations and work it into what we're seeing today, whether it's a case of Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein or Leslie Wexner, all of these people. There are too many Jews who have been involved in this, which I misbrauch, in this kind of as sexual assault and trafficking of young girls. And this goes back to Bertha Pappenheim's efforts at the turn of the century against what used to be called white slavery, that is, international trafficking of Jewish girls, including to South America, girls from Russia, from Ukraine, young women sent by Jewish men into prostitution. We need to talk about that. We need to talk about the legacy of that, how that can exist. We need to pay attention to some of the bad parts of our own tradition and how we as Jews have treated other Jews. So I don't think it's a matter of changing or omitting the text. It's a matter of how we relate to it and talk about it. I think the texts have a lot to teach us, including in the passages that are sexist and offensive, because we haven't moved beyond that as a society. And so it's a chance to hold up a mirror to ourselves.
Dr. Heschel, thank you so much. I hope you have an amazing trip to Brazil. I'm sure you will enjoy it there. It's a great country. It's a great community. I hope you have a lot of fun there.
Thank you so much. Great to meet you.
Great to meet you, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
See you next time. Bye-bye.